Without further ado, Dr. Rothwell, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me pull up my slides. And let me get them in proper order here. Technology is always our challenge these days. So again, I'm delighted to be with you. I just got back from Saudi Arabia, and I'm delighted to be talking to what I hope is a global audience on a topic that I have been recently intrigued with, and that is this idea of devoting more time and attention to a very old topic in the talent development or learning and development field, and that is the topic of transfer of training, which is sometimes called transfer of learning. And it's basically the same thing. So today's topic is from near to far, the evolving role of transfer in talent development. My agenda today, like a good manager, I have an agenda, even though we have an hour or less with each other. And I want to talk a bit about, just give you an introduction, and then we'll define what we mean by the terms near and far transfer. We'll talk about some practical strategies to ensure near transfer. We'll talk about some practical strategies to deal with far transfer, which has been far less studied and researched. And then we'll summarize. And I will be giving you some tools as part of this presentation. So, of course, I've mentioned a few of my books. George mentioned my 158 books. My most recent book, just published last month, is on the left, Succession Planning for Small and Family Businesses. I've given training all over China on succession planning. Some of you may have attended some of my sessions at Shanghai Jiao Tong University or other places. I've taught at Beida, Nankai, Fudan, many other schools in China. You can see my book on performance improvement, one of them, which was translated into Chinese. The English title is Beyond Training and Development, pretty well-known book in the States. And the more recent book that's related to performance technology is my book, Human Performance Improvement, just published in a 3rd edition. If you don't know my background, I've been an ISPI member, and I did the Human Performance Improvement Study, which is ASTD or ATD's term for performance technology. I did the competency study for that, which is the basis for their certificate in human performance improvement. So I have other books out recently. The book on the left came out in 2022. The book in the middle on diversity, which is a very hot topic in the US, just came out this year. And the book on transformational coaching is not yet in print, but it will be in print come June of 2023. So those are just a sample of some of the work I have been doing. Let's get right into the topic of near and far transfer. So when we think about the topic of transfer of learning, it refers to how much of what people learned on through training transfers back to their job in changed behavior. So how much did the training really impact what they do day to day on the job? Why do we care about that? Well, the research tells us that less than 8% of on-the-job behavior transfers back from training. Let me emphasize that. According to research, less than 8% of off-the-job training transfers back to the job in changed behavior. You might say, well, why is that? That means that for every $1 we invest in training, we only get 8 cents back. That's a pretty poor investment. And so it raises the question, why is that? Well, one reason, of course, is that human short-term memory loss is very bad. We lose about 80% of what we hear within 48 hours of hearing it. So that means, like the old saying in English, it goes in one ear and out the other. We forget what we've heard within 48 hours, about 80% of it. So that leaves another 12% if you are doing the mathematics. Where do the other 12% loss go to yield that 8% figure, which is the sticking power of training back on the job? Well, the other 12% is lost because typically when we conduct training, it is an individually focused change effort. That means we might send one person at a time from the project team or from our work group to training. The other team members are typically not there. It's one person at a time who is very often attending and participating in the training. So the coworkers haven't heard the same thing that the trainee heard. The manager, the person who supervises that worker who's gone to training, also has not heard what that worker has heard. So when the worker returns to the job with new information gained in off-the-job training, he or she is not encouraged to practice what they have been trained to do because their boss didn't hear it, their coworkers didn't hear it, and therefore when they try to apply it, very often they are met with jokes and people saying, why are you doing that? And the person says, I learned that in a training program. And the other people say, well, that's nonsense. Do it the old way. Do it the way we've always done it. Therefore, the learning does not stick on the job. So this is why we care about transfer of learning. If we could improve the amount of sticking power, of sustainability of the training, we would be able to get more value for every for all the money we invest in training, which is quite a lot. Globally, I've heard the figure used that every year more than 300 billion US dollars is spent worldwide by training organizations investing in training. Well, just think of that. If $300 billion is being spent and only 8% of it is transferring back to the job in changed behavior, isn't it worth our time and money to talk about ways to improve that transfer? So that's why I am so interested in this topic. So I have a creative spirit and I like to reinvent things. So I'm showing you a slide that may look somewhat familiar, but it may also look somewhat different from what you are accustomed to seeing. I would ask you, if we were in a live session, show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Donald Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of training evaluation? Okay, I see George raising his hand, and you'll recognize that that's on this chart. At the very bottom, you have reaction, How much did people like the training they participated in? And that's quite often measured in participant evaluation forms, which about 93% of all training and learning and development departments do some kind of end of class evaluation form. And most colleges do the same. There is some kind of a student evaluation at the end of the course, asking people basically how much did they like the training they received. The second level up in Kirkpatrick's famous model of training evaluation is learning. And learning, of course, is measured through testing. And we can do testing, paper and pencil, like multiple choice, but there are many other kinds of tests, such as performance tests. Can you just do it? If we train you, for example, on job interviewing skills, at the end of the training, we can give you a role play and we can videotape it. And then trained observers can watch the video to see if you demonstrate the behaviors you were trained to demonstrate as a job interviewer. That measures learning. The third level, and I'm going through this explanation for a reason, so bear with me. This is relevant to transfer of training. The third level is behavior change. How much of the training you received transfers back to the job? And that's the third level that Kirkpatrick talks about. The fourth level is results. That's how much productivity gain or cost savings we realize, but we don't put money to that. We only measure the productivity gain or the monetary savings as a result of the training. So we're measuring results, productivity differences, not money. That's the next level, the fifth level, which Jack Phillips added to the famous Kirkpatrick model. So Jack Phillips has spent his life and career training people and writing about return on investment, ROI, which some people call cost benefit analysis. And in recent years, we've added a sixth level to this training evaluation pyramid, and that's measuring business impact. How much did training, or if you want to call it learning and development, was contributed to the strategic gains of the company? We can measure that through the gain that the individual had in their key performance indicators. So the company sets the targets using a balanced scorecard at the strategic level, cascades that all the way down the company through the divisions, departments, teams, and finally to the individual worker. And at the individual level, it's turned into key performance indicators. And then we can ask the question, how much did training contribute to the individual's gain or loss in key performance indicators? And that transfers right back to the company's strategic goals. So how much did the workers' learning contribute to the competitive advantage of the company? That's the sixth and highest level. So I add a time grid to this hierarchy that Kirkpatrick began with. And I added the before the change or before training, during the change or during the training, immediately following the change, right after the training, or long after the change or long after the training. What does that mean? Well, it means we reinvent the grid and we reinvent the way we think about training evaluation. We can think about how much are the expectations that people have for learning and development before they attend. What were their attitudes during the training event? And then how did they like the training at the end? That's all reaction level measures. And if we asked people a year after they attended a training session, do you remember that course you took on whatever? How much did you like that? People will often, they can't even remember they had the course a year later. So long after the training event, what was the impact? How much did they like it a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later? How much real impact did it have on their lives? That's the question. We can do the same thing with learning. We can measure a pretest before the learning. We can do it during the learning. That's what a midterm exam does in college. And at the end of a course, the final exam, we can give you a test to see how much you learned from the course. But we could also test you later, perhaps on the job, and give you a written test to see how much you remembered at some distant point in time. And we do the same thing with behavior change, and that's the one that's relevant to transfer of learning. So we can measure the behaviors people demonstrated before the training, during the training, immediately following the training, which we call near transfer, and long after the training, far transfer. We can do the same with the other levels of the pyramid. So I'm not going to go over today the result level, the financial impact level, or the business impact level of evaluating learning and development. A lot of people have found this Rothwell reinvention of the Kirkpatrick and Phillips grid very interesting, because you can address measures or metrics in each of the cells of this grid. So I want you to think about that as we continue the presentation talking about transfer. But transfer focuses primarily on behavior change immediately after the training event, and then far transfer is about behavior change long after the training event. So another way to think about it is, in a lot of training books, that follow the Bob Mager approach to training, where the emphasis is on objectives. We are all trained, if we've had courses in Train the Trainer, that it's very important to find out the needs of the learners and then develop training objectives that, when they're met by the end of the training, people have met their needs, and therefore by achieving the training objectives. But there's other ways we can think about training or learning objectives, and that's relevant for transfer of training. So objectives give us the way to meet needs. But traditionally, trainers have focused on instructional objectives, and those are meant to be achieved by the end of a training program. Or you could use instructional objectives in any kind of learning experience. We could have instructional objectives for a job rotation, or for a mentoring experience, or for one-on-one or group coaching. Typically, that's sometimes not done, but we could do it. And if we did, typically instructional objectives are all about meeting those objectives by the end of the learning experience, not back on the job. And that may mean that we need to rethink the way we look at instructional objectives. So in recent years, there's been research and writing on the importance of performance objectives. What's the difference between instructional objectives and performance objectives? I think it's pretty simple. Instructional objectives are met by the end of the training. Performance objectives are met back on the job, immediately upon the return of the learner. So why don't trainers do that? You might ask yourself that question. If we were in a live presentation, I would stop here and ask you, why do we in the training field focus our attention on meeting instructional objectives, and we don't focus our attention on on-the-job impact, immediate on-the-job impact? Well, in recent years, some people say we should, because of that problem with only 8% of off-the-job training transferring back to the job and changed behavior. That's so much time, money, and effort lost that it would make sense that we start to focus on what happens after the training back on the job. But we still didn't address the question, why didn't we do that before? Why did Bob Mager become famous for creating instructional objectives rather than performance objectives? I think the answer is pretty simple. Trainers can't control what happens back on the job. Trainers can control what happens at the end of the training. And so it's a question of what can you control? Trainers control the off-the-job training experience. The classroom the person is in, the rotation program the person is experiencing, whatever it happens to be, as long as the trainer is involved, the trainer can exert control over what is happening. But as soon as the worker returns to the job, and this is particularly true if there are many different workers from many different teams in the company, they go back to different work environments, to different microcultures, different teams, different coworkers, different bosses who have different expectations of what they will do on the job. So that makes it much harder to do performance objectives if we are a trainer or a talent development professional, as we now call the field, talent development. But there's yet another angle that I believe we should consider, and it is particularly important because of the growing importance of innovation in the global economy. You know, it seems like when we look at the return on investment for training, we forget something really important. And that is that typically we look at the cost benefit of training, how much people immediately applied back on the job. But we forget that people are very creative. That is the one thing human beings do better than computers, at least so far. I don't know if you've been following ChatGPT, but ChatGPT can now write papers for college students. And so there is artificial intelligence is increasingly creative. So computers may someday, very soon, be exerting creative thinking, maybe better than a human being. So that's a concern. But my point is, there could be a third kind of objective that we could establish that would be tied to innovation. People are not mindless robots. When they go back to the job, if they learn something new, they may apply their own creative thinking to this new thing they learned. You know, I got some of my best ideas for books while I was sitting in a training program with my mind wandering. For all we know, Bill Gates came up with Microsoft and Windows while he was in a training program doodling on a piece of paper. And he became one of the world's richest men by doing that. We don't know. But my point is, people learn more from training than just what they are taught. They can take what they learned in the training and apply it creatively to new ways of serving their customers, new markets that the company could sell their products or services to, new ways of doing things, new ways of serving customers. And this, to me, is very exciting because that's something we don't measure when we look at ROI. So think about that. So as we go into this, think about the definition of near transfer, which I think itself has not been studied nearly enough. It can occur most readily when we see people apply on their job pretty much what they were taught to do in an off-the-job training experience. And this is important, as I said, because only 8% of off-the-job training transfers back. We care about near transfer because it's conducted, training is conducted so that people can do their jobs better. This is the whole point of doing training. Of course, we all know in the performance technology field that quite often training is the performance solution of last resort. Why? Because of this problem of 8%, only 8% of impact. There are much more impactful ways we can address human job performance. We can get better impact through feedback systems, some of them automated. There are now systems, example, the military has a gun that you can point and shoot, and an onboard artificial intelligence will inform the soldier how close he or she came to the target. Immediate machine feedback on human performance. That's much more powerful than off-the-job training. My point being that we still need to think about creative applications. Maybe that soldier might come up with an even better way than the machine is directing him or her to do to reach the target. You see what I'm saying? That's my point here. So near transfer is important because we want to increase the value we are getting for the money and time we spend on training. And the same principle, by the way, applies to education. Children in school have some of the same issues that trainees have in training programs. We focus on teaching the child what to do, how to work a math problem. But do we teach them to think creatively beyond what they were immediately taught? That's the FAR transfer challenge. So FAR transfer are those creative insights that are stimulated by participating in a learning experience. Maybe they grow out of the learning experience directly. Maybe they are an accidental outcome of the learning. How do we capture that if it is an accidental outcome of the learning process? That's what fascinates me, because we may have ignored most of the value of training and learning because it came from giving people new ideas. And how do we measure that? It's very easy to measure behavioral change back on the job. We have the instructional objectives. We can see how well people applied what they were trained to do back on the job. Not so easy to capture what they learned creatively and then reinvented their job based on the learning they received. So FAR transfer, this creative spark that comes about as a result of learning, planned learning, it can be critical at a time when the world's economy is turning to an innovation-based economy, where the most famous companies are those like Google and Microsoft and others, Apple, which, because of their innovations, have become the poster children for the future world economy. Shouldn't we be thinking about the role of learning and development in creating that innovation? And so far, we have not adequately been measuring that. To me, that's what's exciting about FAR transfer. So I want you to pause a moment and reflect, and I want you to state in your own words, I've told you several times, how I define FAR transfer. By the way, if you do a Google search on this and you start reading the academic literature, you will discover there's different definitions of the term FAR transfer. It's not just the one that I defined. There are also other definitions of FAR transfer. You need to be aware of that. So, but when I use the term, I'm talking about learning events that spark creative thinking that people apply in their work or in their lives. You know, we may go to a training program and someone may ask us a question in the course that changes our lives. How do you measure that? I know from personal experience that my life was changed by a question a teacher asked me when I was in 8th grade. When I was in 8th grade, I had a teacher that I just worshiped. I thought he was what every man should be like. I just worshiped him. And I worshiped him so much that I set out to get 100% on every test he gave. And my hand was always up first in class whenever he asked a question. I wanted to be on his radar screen. And so teachers talk among themselves, and I was not a good student in my other classes. I got C's, sometimes even D's. I was not a good student because I didn't care that much. I didn't care about other courses. I cared about his course because of him. And so he took me aside and he said, you know, Bill, I've been talking to the other teachers and they don't understand it. In my course, you get 100%. In fact, you teach me things that I didn't know about the course that I am teaching. And yet in the other courses, the teachers report that you're not a very good student. If you can do that in my course, you can do that in all the other courses. Why don't you? And it was that question that changed my life. That's how I got all these awards, how I wrote all these books. A life change as a result of one question. How do you measure the ROI of that? That's pretty important, I think. So I want you to be thinking about, how do you define FAR transfer? How do you define near transfer? And more importantly, what are you doing in your organization to improve the on-the-job impact of the learning and development events that your company spends so much time and effort investing in? How are you making sure you're getting better results? George?
Yeah, Dr. Rothwell, thank you so much. So far, I learned is that file transfer will be far more important in the future for the innovation economy in the world, actually, across the world. So as if I were in charge of my company's training and I'm a company for profit, I'm in developing country or developed country, wherever I am, but how do I keep the balance of far and near transfer? Because I have a job to do. And if far transfer is not measurable and I cannot demonstrate its value, how do I justify my existence on my training budget, my value, all that questions, good old questions have been bothering us for decades.
Yes, and of course, anyone who's been in the training field for very long knows that one of the first questions we often hear when managers have a problem and they feel that problem has not been solved, one of the frequent questions they will ask is, well, what was the return on investment of that training? And quite often that is in my experience, is a trick question, because when that question is asked, they often know from their own feeling the problem they had that they hoped training would solve has not gotten better. Maybe it's even gotten worse. And they use the language of ROI as a way to say that. So my experience has been if we get the ROI question, their pain has not been diminished. But to get to your question, I'm going to talk about ways we can start to gather information about both near and far transfer. There are many resources that can help us. Near transfer has been examined and studied a lot more than far transfer has been. But I've been thinking about it, and I believe I have ways to capture information about far transfer that can be very compelling. I find that often managers are very interested to hear anecdotal information from their workers about how they solve real problems in the workplace. And some of those may relate directly to near transfer, but others may have to do with the creative application of new ideas. And I have a way to get that. So I will be sharing that, and in fact, giving you a tool you can take away and start to use in your organization to do just that. So bear with me. So it's possible to gather data on the job. We can go out and we can count how often people demonstrated the observable behaviors that we taught them. That's particularly easy to do in some types of training. For example, if you're teaching them job interviewing, we can develop a checklist of the behaviors we taught them to demonstrate, and then we can go out on the job and we can sit in on a job interview they conduct, and we can go through and check off the number of times they demonstrate the behavior that we trained them to do. And in fact, the military does exactly that with soldiers. The drill sergeant is given a checklist of what the soldier was trained to do in boot camp, and then they go through a drill or a military exercise, and the sergeant checks off what behaviors that soldier actually demonstrated. That's a way to measure near transfer. We can ask people, we can poll them about their own perceptions. For example, we can have somebody attend a supervisory training session, and then we can poll their workers, the supervisor's workers, and we can say, these are the behaviors your supervisor was trained to demonstrate with you. How often do you see these behaviors demonstrated in your interaction with your boss? And we can survey the workers and find out the near transfer of supervisory training or sales training for that matter, same principle. We can examine measurable results that stem from those behaviors. Again, that's up the Kirkpatrick pyramid to the results level, and we can see what kind of productivity gain resulted from the behavior change that we had. Now, I'm giving you a tool that helps you look at near transfer. So I hope ISPI, when they publish this video, will make sure that whoever observes it also gets the 3 tools that I am giving you. And I deliberately embedded the tools into the slides so that you would know that there were tools, but I'm not showing you the whole tools because that's too difficult. You may be looking at this on a cell phone screen and you won't be able to see the issues, but you will get a copy, hard copy of these. The point is, you can look at the role played in near transfer by the worker, by the worker's direct boss, by the worker's coworkers, by the company. So many different groups or stakeholders have a role to play in supporting near transfer. The instrument, and I'm only showing you one of the pages of it, will help you measure that for your own company. And it will give you ideas about how you might be able to increase the impact of near transfer. So I want you to be thinking, reflect again on this question. The biggest barrier in my organization to near transfer of training is what? What is it that gets in the way of people applying back on their jobs what they learned in training? Just think about it. Is it the amount of time they have? Is it the support they have from their boss? Is it having the money and the other resources they need? What would you say is the biggest reason why people don't apply back on the job immediately what they learned in training? Well, you could run focus groups and ask your workers that question, and you might get some really interesting information that you could lay in front of managers who are asking you about ROI. So let's talk about FAR transfer strategies. Here's a poll, and I would ask you to reflect on this. In my organization, workers routinely meet with their supervisors before training to clarify how they could use training to stimulate their creative thinking about ways to improve their jobs. Do you do that as a routine practice? How about supervisors routinely meet with their workers who attended the training to ask them tough questions to stimulate their thinking beyond what the training program taught them to do? How many of your companies do that sort of thing? Well, those are tactics, strategies to encourage FAR transfer. So here are some other things. We can reinvent end of course evaluations, and we can rethink the questions we ask on those. This is an assignment I love to give my postgraduate students. I give them an example of a evaluation sheet that's handed out at the end of a training program. And I say, I'd like you to reinvent that evaluation form so that you can measure all 6 levels: reaction, learning, behavior change, results, ROI, and business impact. I want you to do all that on a smile sheet, a participant eval. And of course, this drives them crazy. And that's what I'm trying to do, is stimulate their creative thinking and get them to think beyond our traditional paradigm or way of thinking about what we ask on a smile sheet, like, did you like the food we gave you? Did you like the training activities? Were the handouts clear? Were there typos in material you received? stupid questions. We should be asking them tough questions to get them to think. By the way, you can measure all 6 levels on a participant form. Not well, but you can do it. So that, and I won't tell you the answer to that. We can do another session sometime, and I'll train you on how we could do all 6 levels on an evaluation sheet. But we can reinvent end of course evaluations, and we can ask workers, what new ideas did you have in this course that you can take back to your job and do your job in new ways, serve your customers in new ways, do your work in more productive ways, and in short, stimulate their thinking about more creative, innovative ways to do their work and serve their customers. We can also ask them to identify the barriers the company puts in place that keeps them from being more productive. That's an assignment I love to give when I do consulting. When I've done work on the high performance workplace, I bring focus groups of workers together and I ask them the question, what does the company do that gets in the way of your productivity? And they often give me long lists on flip charts. And when I give those to managers, I hear defensive reactions. Managers don't want to hear that many of the problems that get in the way of company productivity are actually the fault of managers. And so this is something, the job of a manager should be to knock down the barriers that get in the way of competitive advantage. The job of a manager should be to stimulate the creative thinking of their workers so that the workers exceed their boss in ability. And that can be very scary to bosses because a lot of bosses feel threatened when they're dealing with an extremely talented worker who's got very creative thinking. And yet, the most effective bosses are able to do that. Just like the most effective sports coaches are able to encourage athletes, super athletes, who are much better at the sport than the coach is, but the coach has the skill to bring out that talent. That's what managers should do. So think about what data can we use to measure FAR transfer. Here's one way. We can count how often innovative new behaviors are demonstrated. Instead of going out there with a checklist of what we taught them, go out there with a checklist that's open-ended and try to find out what was new that was better than what we trained them to do. Poll people about their own perceptions of new behaviors demonstrated after training that was more effective than people demonstrated before the training. Examine the measurable results. So I'm giving you 2 instruments to deal with FAR transfer. Here's the first one shown on this slide. And for each question, we ask for the learners to give us answers. This uses a method, some of you may be familiar with this, a book was written on it, called the Success Case Method by Professor Robert Brinkerhoff. And he used a very old method called the critical incident method, which was actually invented by the US military in World War II to train bomber pilots. And it's still used today as a major feature of HR. Many HR approaches stem right from critical incidents. Well, I've reinvented critical incidents to try to capture innovative behaviors that were demonstrated on the job that came about as a result of training. Could you tell me a story about a time when you came up with a new creative idea during online or on-site training that you could apply on your job? Describe it. Tell how you applied the new idea. Tell me what results you obtained from it. What was the value of what you did? While financial value is one way to find value, There are other ways to find value, such as enhanced customer service, improved employee development, or other value adds that may not have financial impact, but may be important to the company nevertheless. Who was involved in this situation? When and where did it occur? What was the training course that sparked this creativity? Where did this occur? And why do you believe this new idea was especially important to the organization? I've used this instrument, and you don't always get every employee answering it, but you will get a few. And over time, you will start to identify ways that the training sparks creative, innovative thinking. This is powerful stuff. Now, here's the second instrument I'm giving you. And this, of course, is just the first page of that instrument. You have to get the full instrument to see it. But again, I look at the role played by all the key stakeholders, like top managers, middle managers, team leaders, workers, co-workers, customers. Everyone can have a role to play in stimulating your creative thinking. And it can come about as a result of what you learned in a training experience. And so I'm giving you the tool, and you can creatively reinvent it. I don't think it's finished. This is a draft. It's a beginning. But you have to apply your own creative, innovative thinking to it. I'm giving you that innovative challenge. So the biggest barrier to FAR transfer is what? What is it? What do you think? In your own organization, what's the biggest barrier to FAR transfer? Is it peer pressure? It might be. If you come up with a great new idea, other people get envious. Even your boss might get envious. If you come up with an earth-shaking idea, people sometimes don't want to accept it because they worry that it makes you look too good. Maybe you'll get a bigger raise. Maybe you'll get a bigger, faster promotion. That can be a barrier to encouraging people to think creatively. You know, on one of my trips to China, someone said that there was an old Chinese saying, which I can't say in Mandarin. My Chinese teacher gave up on me because my pronunciation was so bad. She spent hours trying to teach me how to say Ren Li Ziwan Kai Fa, which you probably don't understand, which is training, Pei Shun. And so basically, my point is that in China, I heard the saying that people say that if your head sticks above the crowd, it might get cut off. And the same is true with creative thinking. If you have a wonderful new idea, sometimes that can make you stand out above the crowd and can make you a target of envy, of jealousy. And I think that's a big barrier to encouraging competitive advantage in today's companies. We have a lot of bureaucrats who love to say no to any new idea, and they kill innovation. They kill creativity. They kill competitive advantage. I know very well, I'm at a university. We're ruled by bureaucrats. All they say is no to every new idea. So it's very difficult to get new ideas through the system. So what have I been talking about today? Well, there are 3 tools I gave you. I define near and far transfer of training and learning and explain why those you might care about those. I described some typical ways of designing training where we think about meeting instructional objectives in order to meet needs. But I also told you about performance objectives to measure near transfer, and then a new kind of objective to measure far transfer, to set up targets for FAR transfer. And I gave you some new ways to think about both near and far transfer, and emphasize the importance of far transfer in a global economy that is headed toward an innovation-based approach. So we also have the 3 handouts you should be sure to get as part of this talk. George, do you have, since we don't have a live audience, were there any questions other than the one you raised that we might ask? And you'll see my email address on this final slide. That's my university address. I check it very often. So if you send it to me at wjr9psu.edu, I will get it. But George, did you have any questions you wanted to ask me that came up during the course of my presentation?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rothwell. And I certainly have tons of questions to ask you, actually. I raised my first question about how to keep the balance, and, and then later on, you just, as you just mentioned, the far transfer and for the innovation for innovation activities in organizations, how do we motivate them? I have a thought, far transfer may take more, may have more effectiveness if the manager, you mentioned the role of manager, how important it is to encourage and motivate far transfer and innovation. So my thinking is, so that manager may play a comprehensive role, not only manage, but also lead. So it's not only management skills involved, the management mechanism and all the management algorithm involved, but also leadership. I mean, how to inspire, how to lead, how to engage, and how to support employee.
Yes.
The best managers, I have 2 angel bosses, one in America, one in China, during my career. Both are female, but they both said, George, I work for you. Look how powerful you are. That kept me living for 2 weeks. That one sentence, that's how powerful managers, when they demonstrate a certain level of leadership and they can inspire people, and the power within people can be ignited just like that. So
I agree with that completely. Yeah. And the role of the manager is critical, but so is the role of other groups, such as your coworkers. Your coworkers can discourage people from applying new ideas. They can make fun of it. They can be jealous and envious if you get recognized for a new idea that leads to a big company breakthrough. They're going to be upset that you got that recognition.
By the way, professional jealousy is everywhere, actually, unfortunately. And when you said that there are also discouragement and, saying the nays, to innovative ideas, it not only exists some cultures, but every culture has yes and no's. And, in some culture, I know when I was an English major 30 years ago, I learned the American, US and Chinese culture per se are a lot of different, not only different, but the opposite. And then our professor said, well, in the American culture, in English, you can say the first bird get the worm. But in Chinese, we say the first bird get shot. So that's how, that's how the difference, it's the same applies to different cultures. And Dr. Rothwell, you just mentioned that innovation in many cultures, I think there must be cultural ingredients in there that you probably won't have time to talk about, but I think you went there but didn't have many time to talk about. But I really hope that in the future you can have more time to share with us and in that direction as well.
I think experiential learning itself is a method to spark innovation. I think when we give people small group exercises or even very large group exercises where they where they face an open-ended, unstructured problem to solve, that sparks creative thinking. So I
You
don't know
bet.
if you agree with that, but that's what I think.
Yep, you bet, you bet. Anyway, far transfer. Unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour right now, and we have to kind of close the session right now. But I want to thank you, Dr. Rothwell, again for your sharing, unselfish sharing. This is really, I learned a lot. Of course, today we have some difficulty, and then we don't have any live audiences except a few of us here, but we will push it out. And then when our audience are watching right now is a recorded session, but you have Dr. Rothwell's email, and then you can ask him, sending him an email. He's very open. For all these years I know him. He's very open, very frank, and also very candid thinker and thought leader in many HRD and HRM fronts. So, and by the way, Dr. Rothwell, you're Chinese. I got that. That was HRD. What you said, HRD and training both.
Yeah.
You got all those right. When you said that in Chinese,
Well,
I
at
got
least
that.
you could recognize my pronunciation, but my Chinese teacher was not at all pleased with the way I pronounce things.
Well, I want to tease you about that. That at least worth 83 trips to China. Make it worth, right? Anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Rothwell. And that brings us to the end of the 22nd episode of ISPI Live. Yes, ISPI Live is also ISPI.live. We have a separate website under ISPI Live. Under ISPI.org. Thank you all for watching and participating. Again, apologize again for today's technical difficulty. If you're happy with our session, please like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget, share. Also, very important note, as you can see that on my screen, this direction, ISPI 2023 annual conference will be held at the Old Colonial Style Woodlands Hotel in Williamsburg, Virginia. The date will be April 23rd to 27th, 2023, this year, in 2 months. So mark your calendar. The date is April 23rd to 27th, 2023. ISPI Live is a weekly program on every Saturday at noon U.S. Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific. If you have not joined ISPI yet, we welcome you to visit our website at ispi.org. Again, ISPI.live is up. If you have any questions, suggestions, or even want to speak on ISPI Live and have any recommendations, please visit ispi.live and let us know what you're thinking, what you thought, and how we can do better to serve you. We can do better, especially ISPI members. Next week on February 11th, we will have Mr. Gonzalo Rujigras and Villanueva from Mexico to talk about economic and social impact of the internationalization strategy based on mega planning applied in the region of Mexico. So I hope I got that name right. And if not, I will do better next time. We thank Dr. Rothwell again for today's sharing, and our very own Jennifer Romer today as the operator on the background. Thank you both. And Dr. Rothwell, again, he is an overachiever, one of the overachievers. He wrote many books. He's one of my models I always look up to, and an old friend of mine on a personal note, but he is very recognized and respected scholar, thought leader in this field. Again, this is George Gu hosting live for you from Shanghai, China. It is 2:05 a.m. here. Thank you all for your support. See you next week. Have a great swelling weekend. Thank you, and signing off.